G'day, this is Chris Savage from Arrival Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to the final session of the first coming prophecies of Messiah. I pray that it will be a benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so we're into session 6, which is the final of the first coming prophecies, and we're going to be looking at the messianic timetable tonight and in this session, and we're going to be finding that in Daniel chapter 9 verses 1 to 27. Okay, now who is Daniel? Well, Daniel was a prophet. In fact, the book of Daniel in the Hebrew scriptures gives us the most detail of any books regarding the coming of Messiah. That he was a prophet is well substantiated. Why? Because remember, a prophet is substantiated because of his near-term prophecies. If they come to pass, long-term ones will come to pass as well. So he accurately prophesied the rise of the Medo-Persian empires, the Greek, the Roman empires, and even at a time when the Babylonian Empire was at its highest, which preceded them, he prophesied that they'd be replaced by these other empires. He also accurately predicted the fortunes of the wars and the conspiracies of the two kingdoms of Syria and Egypt. You know, that's when the Greek Empire was fracturing, and then the Romans were coming up. He prophesied the Syrian-Egypt conflict. He prophesied the role of the Maccabees during this period. So, you know, in actual fact, you know, Daniel was so accurate with his prophecies that many tried to claim that the book of Daniel was written after the fact, after the events had actually taken place, because they could not believe, this is the liberal theologians, could not believe that prophecies could be so spot on. Now, the book was completed about 530 BC, and the key prophecies which are of interest in the study we're doing is what's in verses 24 to 27, Daniel 9, 24 to 27. But we need to look at the whole chapter just to get a bit of a background to what's going on. Okay, so background is in verses 1 to 2. The date for Daniel's prophecy we see is in the first year of Darius. So it occurred in the year 539 BC. And that's about 66 or 67 years after the Jews initially went into exile to Babylon in 604, 605 BC. Now, Daniel is in Babylon, and he said he was studying the scriptures, and from these scriptures, he now came to the conclusion that the number of years for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem was almost over, because the duration of that exile, desolation, was to be 70 years. Now, Daniel mentioned he was studying books, and one of them was the writings of Jeremiah, and he tells us that. He speaks about Jeremiah. Now, he was also because remember, both Jeremiah and Daniel did overlap to some extent. Now, he says here, he said, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So on two occasions in the book of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 25, 10 to 14, and Jeremiah 29, 10 to 14, Jeremiah predicted that the captivity and desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. Now, notice that Daniel said books. Well, we don't know what other books he was studying, but we know he was studying the book of Jeremiah, but there are some strong possibilities that he also studied the book of Isaiah. Why? Because Isaiah actually named Cyrus as the one who would permit the Jews to return, and you can find that in Isaiah 44, verses 28 to 45, verse 1. What else would he be studying? Well, he would have had the Torah, for instance, the other writings in Moses and some of the earlier prophets. Also gave some specific conditions for the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. And Daniel may have looked at some of these as well. Leviticus, for instance, Leviticus 26, 40 to 43, and 1 Kings 8, 46 to 53. Jeremiah 3, 12 to 18, and Hosea 5:15 to 6:3. Now, Hosea 5:15 to 6:3 tells us that Messiah will not return unto the Jews, confess their one iniquity and call for his return. So it would have been a good book for Daniel to be reading. Now, these passages emphasize that Israel as a nation must repent and they must confess their sin prior to the establishment of the kingdom of the Messiah. Now, counting the 70 years, because it's almost 70 years, counting the 70 years from the year 605 BC, which is the first of the three deportations into exile, 605, and then it was 597 and 586. So counting 70 years from 605 would bring the end of those 70 years to 536 BC. Right about there, 536 BC, 605, 604 BC, right about 536. So that was about only another 3 years away for the exile to end. So Daniel is, almost there. Now, the city and the temple were not destroyed until 586. If the 70 years began then, it would mean that the 70 years would not be until 515 BC. But Daniel's calculation began with 605, which was the first deportation, not 597 BC, the second, or 586, the third. He started with the first deportation, which was in 605. So he counted 70 years from 605 BC. Now, he not only expected the captivity to end after the 70 years, but he also expected an end to any possibility of future desolations for Jerusalem. Why? Because he believed that after the 70 years, the Messianic kingdom was about to happen, was about to be set up. As the word of God was to be established on the basis of prayer, he prayed. And realizing that the prerequisite was a confession of national sin, he confessed the sins of Israel. Now, Daniel's prayer we see in verses 3 to 19. And we see it in two portions. The first is verses 3 to 14, and that's the confession of sin. And Daniel says this as he writes in his book in verse 4. He said, I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed and said, alas, O Lord, the great and awesome God. Then into verse 5. We have sinned, committed iniquity, acted wickedly, and rebelled, even turning aside from your commandments and ordinances. Moreover, we have not listened to your servants, the prophets. So, Daniel acknowledged both sin and guilt, which had been incurred in two ways. First, disobedience to the law of Moses, where it says your commandments and ordinances, that's the Mosaic law. And second, by disobedience to the prophets who came after Moses. Now, notice that Daniel never denied the sin of his nation, nor his own sin. Notice he uses the pronoun we in verse 5. We have sinned, puts himself amongst them. So he fully identified with the Jewish people in their sins. He didn't see sin as a bad habit, but as something which was deeply ingrained in the people that had brought on divine judgment. And then in verse 7, he says, righteousness belongs to you, O Lord, but to us, confusion of face or open shame, you might have it in your translation. So this disobedience to both the law and the prophets caused Israel literally confusion of face. And what's that? Well, it's a Jewish idiom meaning a sense of shame. It was a sense of shame. It also resulted in the need for forgiveness. Now here, Daniel confessed that to God belonged forgiveness and mercy, and that forgiveness was needed. So Daniel concluded the first part of his prayer by describing the punishment for sin and guilt in verse 14. Therefore, the Lord has kept ready the calamity and has brought it upon us. Now, that calamity, that punishment, was captivity in Babylon. And that confirmed the words of the prophets who had predicted it, and that also confirmed the law of Moses, which taught that divine judgment would come as a result of disobedience. Remember, Mosaic law says, if you obey me and do this, I will bless you. If you disobey me and don't do what I tell you, I'm going to curse you. And this is exactly what's happening here. Second part of the prayer is in verses 15 to 19, and here we have a plea for mercy. Now, Daniel made his plea for mercy on the basis of righteousness, but it's not Israel's righteousness, because we know Israel wasn't righteous, but it's on the basis of God's righteousness. And he also pleaded for mercy on the basis of God's grace, for Israel did not merit any mercy, but the grace of God was and is still able to extend it anyway. I mean, might have a look around today. We see the grace and mercy of God being extended to the world we live in right now. Also, the righteousness of God required God to fulfill his promises, and therefore he should do so at the end of the 70-year period. God says the captivity was going to be 70 years long, so the righteousness of God required him to fulfill it and to end it at the end of 70 years. Now, the conclusion of Daniel's prayer is pretty dramatic, isn't it? It says in verse 19, "O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and take action. For thine own sake, O my God, do not delay, because thy city and thy people are called by thy name." Now, when Daniel asked God to not delay, he's asking God to count the 70 years from 605 BC and not 597 or 586 BC. He says, Lord, pray God, it comes in the next 3 years when it's due from 605 BC. Please, God, don't delay and make it from 597 BC. But it will come 3 years later. But while he's praying, in verse, I think it's verse 20 here, and now while I was speaking and praying, this is Gabriel comes along. Gabriel's an angel. Now, while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God in behalf of the holy mountain of my God. So Daniel was presenting his supplications and he was interrupted. He had some more to say, but Gabriel came in and interrupted his prayer time. And the interruption came about the time of the evening offering. Remember, Daniel is in Babylon, long way away from Israel, long way away from Jerusalem. And this evening offering, this is the daily, regular evening sacrifice that was offered while the temple stood. And remember, the temple got destroyed in 586. Even though it had not been practiced for 7 decades, Daniel showed his longing for the return from captivity and for the rebuilding of the temple by remembering the sacrifices. So he writes about it. He says about the time of the evening sacrifice. So I mean, he's been there for he went down in the first deportation in 605. So he's been there for for almost 70 years, but yet he still remembers the temple rituals, sacrifices, all those things. Now, Gabriel told Daniel in verse 22, I've now come forth to give you insight with understanding. So, purpose of the visit of Gabriel was, first of all, to correct Daniel's misunderstanding concerning when the Messianic kingdom would be set up. And second, to present God's revelation, which contained a timetable for Messiah's first coming. Because remember, Daniel expected the kingdom to be set up at the end of the 70 years. That's why he's praying the prayer of forgiveness for the nation. And that's why he's praying for the kingdom to come. So Gabriel has to just set him correct, set him right. In verse 24, first part of verse 24, we have the decree of the 77s, or some translations have 70 weeks. We'll explain that. So Gabriel's prophecy to Daniel began with the words, 77s have been decreed for your people and your holy city. Now, as I said, a lot of English versions have translated the phrase to read 70 weeks. but this translation is not totally accurate, and it causes a lot of misunderstanding. Most Jews know the Hebrew for the word weeks, because observance of the Feast of Weeks. And that Hebrew word is Shavuot. Shavuot. However, the word that appears here in the Hebrew text is Shavuim, which means sevens. So somewhere along the line, it's been translated as weeks. This word refers to a seven of anything within the context, when the context here is years, and that will determine the content of the seven. So we have the word dozen. It means 12. Could be 12 eggs, could be 12 apples, 12 oranges. It's just a dozen, it's just 12. Now, what's Daniel been thinking about? Daniel's been thinking about 70 years, right? He's thinking in years. So he had assumed two things. He assumed that the captivity would end after 70 years, and then the kingdom would be established after those 70 years. But here, Gabriel was using a bit of a play upon words in the Hebrew text, and he's pointing out that insofar as Messiah's kingdom was concerned, it was not 70 years, but 77s of years, or a total of 490 years. That's 70 by 7 for those who are not mathematicians. So this period of 490 years had been decreed for the Jewish people and for the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, the Hebrew word translated decreed literally means to cut off or to determine. To cut off or to determine. So in Daniel, back in chapters 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, God revealed to Daniel the course of future world history in which Gentiles would have a dominant role over the Jewish people. And this long period began with the Babylonian Empire and was to continue on till the establishment of Messiah's kingdom, when there'd be a Jew upon the throne. Now, this is often referred to as the times of the Gentiles. Now, Daniel was told that a total of 490 years was to be cut out, chopped out of the times of the Gentiles. And this 490-year period, that it is 70 by 7 weeks, had been determined or decreed for the accomplishment of the final restoration of Israel and the establishment of Messiah's kingdom. So the focus of the program of the 77s was your people and your city. Now, Daniel was a Jew, so the people were the Jewish people, and the city was Daniel's city, which was Jerusalem. Now, even though he'd spent much of his life in the city of Babylon, Jerusalem was still Daniel's city. Now, whether Jews are inside the land or outside the land, their city is always Jerusalem, not any other city. Jerusalem is always their home. Now, notice the program here. The program of the 77s does not concern the Gentiles or the church. It specifically concerns the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem. The program of the 77s concerns both the first coming and the second coming, but it is primarily the first coming that is what we're studying here. So now in the second part of verse 24, we see the purpose. And the purpose of the 77s. Daniel was now told by Gabriel the 77s are to accomplish 6 purposes. First 3, they're negative, they're things you don't want, and they'll be removed. And the second 3 are positive, and they're things you really want to be brought in. So the first purpose is to finish the transgression. Now, the Hebrew word translated to finish means to restrain firmly, to restrain completely, or to bring to completion. So Hebrew word translated transgression, it's a very strong word for sin, and it more literally means to rebel. So Hebrew text uses this word with a definite article. It is the transgression or the rebellion. Ooh, so it must be a specific act of rebellion. And this specific act of rebellion is going to finally be restrained and brought to an end. Now, this act of rebellion or transgression is to come under complete control so that it will no longer flourish. Israel's apostasy is now to be firmly restrained, in keeping with a very similar prediction in Isaiah 59 verse 20. Isaiah 59 verse 20. Now, what is this specific rebellion? Well, this specific rebellion is the rejection of the Messiah, as dealt with in Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12. Now, the second purpose of the 77s is to make an end of sin. Now, the Hebrew word translated to make an end literally means to seal up or to shut up in prison. It means to be securely kept, securely locked up, not allowed to roam at random. Now, Hebrew word translated here as sin literally means to miss the mark. So what's this talking about? This refers to sins of daily life rather than to any specific sin. And what we see is that even these sins are now in the kingdom are to be put to an end and taken away. And this is in keeping with the predictions by the prophets who proclaim that in the Messianic kingdom, sinning would cease for Israel. The Jews in the kingdom will not sin. And if you don't believe me, check out Isaiah 27 verse 9, Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27, and Ezekiel 37 verse 23, and also Jeremiah 31 verse 31 to 34. That should ring a bell, that passage. Now, third purpose is to make atonement for iniquity. Hebrew word translated to make atonement is kafar, K-A-P-H-A-R, which has the same root meaning as the word kippur, as in Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. So the third purpose then is to make atonement in some way for iniquity. In fact, it is by means of this atonement that the first two purposes will be accomplished, and that's of finishing the transgression, making an end of sin. There has to be an atonement. The word translated iniquity here refers to inward sin. So this is sometimes been referred to as a sin nature, or perhaps a more common term among Jewish people is the Yetzer hara, the evil inclination. So that's what this is talking about, the inward, the sin nature. Now, the fourth purpose of the 77s is to bring in everlasting righteousness. And this could be more literally translated to bring in an age of righteousness. Now, the Hebrew word olam, which is everlasting, is better translated as age rather than everlasting. It's to bring in an age of righteousness. Now, this age of righteousness is to be the Messianic kingdom spoken of in the prophets, and you find that in Isaiah chapter 1 verse 26, Isaiah 11 verses 2 to 5, Isaiah 32 verse 17, Jeremiah 23 verses 5 to 6, and Jeremiah 33 15 to 18. Now, it is this very age that Daniel has been expecting to see established after the 70 years of captivity. But now he's told by Gabriel that will only be after the 490-year period of the 77s. Long wait. Now, the fifth purpose is to seal up vision and prophecy. And Daniel uses a word which means to shut up. To seal up means to cause a cessation or to completely fulfill. So vision and prophecy are to be completely fulfilled. Now, vision is a reference to oral prophecy, for instance, like Elijah and Elisha, while prophecy refers to written prophecy, and so they're the prophets that we find in the Bible. So both oral and written prophecy will cease with the final fulfillment of all revelations. Why? Because Messiah comes. The final purpose of the 77s is to anoint the most holy place. So where could that be? Well, this is a reference to the Jewish temple, which is to be rebuilt when Messiah comes. Now, this is a temple that Daniel's contemporary Ezekiel was in Babylon when Daniel was there. Ezekiel described in great detail in Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48. That's the temple that will be the Messianic temple, the temple that Messiah will build. The start of the 77s, we find this in the first part of verse 25 of chapter 9. So Daniel was clearly told when the 77s would begin their countdown. Gabriel said, "Know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem." So the 77s, that 490-year period, are going to begin with a decree involving the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. This marks the beginning of 490-year period. Now, we know that not everything in Persian chronology is as clear as we'd like it to be, and there are still some gaps in our knowledge of history. But from what biblical and historical records we do have, there are four possible answers to the question of which decree the passage refers to. There are several decrees, but we find that not all of them fit the bill. We have the options here. We have the decree of Cyrus in 538, 536 BC, Darius Hystaspes in 521 BC, Artaxerxes, which he gave to Ezra in 458 BC, and then Artaxerxes to Nehemiah in 444 BC. So which decree are we talking about? Well, first decree of Cyrus, which came about, as I said, 538, 536, is mentioned in 2 Chronicles 36, 22 to 23, Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, and Ezra chapter 6, verses 1 to 5. Now, that decree is primarily, not exclusively, concerned with the rebuilding of the temple only. Second option is the decree of Darius Hystaspes, given in the year 521 BC and mentioned in Ezra 6, 6 to 12. That decree was a reaffirmation of the first decree of Cyrus. This also concerns the rebuilding of the temple, just like Cyrus's decree did. Number 3 is the decree of Artaxerxes to Ezra, given in 458, and this is mentioned in Ezra 7, 11 to 26. Now, this third decree just gave Ezra permission to proceed with the temple service and is concerned exclusively with that subject. So by this time, the rebuilding of the temple had been completed. The fourth option is a decree of Artaxerxes given to Nehemiah in the year 444 BC, and that's mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 8. And that decree had to do with the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. So which is the best fit? Well, the best fit of these four, the only two that really have any possibility of in fulfilling the wording that Gabriel gave to Daniel, those are the first one, the decree of Cyrus, and the fourth one, the decree of Artaxerxes to Nehemiah. The second was merely a reaffirmation of the first, that's the Darius Hystaspes one, while the third had to do with the functions of the temple. So we only really have two we can choose from. So this is a choice. Although all four decrees did contribute to the rebuilding of Jerusalem, only two of them actually come close. One thing we do know, by the year 444 BC, the countdown of the 77s had begun. First, the first 69 sevens we find in the second part of verse 25. Unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It shall be built again with street and moat, even in troublous times. So these 77s of verse 24 will be subdivided into 3 smaller units. Here we have the first 2 of these subdivisions. We have the first one, the 7 sevens. 7 sevens or 7 sevens or years, 7 sevens of years, 7 years, makes a total of 49 years. So this first 49 years refers to a period of time during which Jerusalem will be rebuilt. And we do know that from the time that the decree of Cyrus to rebuild Jerusalem was issued until the time the building ceased was a period of 49 years. We know that. It shall be built again with street and moat, even in troublous times. Now, if you read through the book of Ezra, you'll soon see that Jerusalem was indeed rebuilt in troublous times. and all sorts of strife with the surrounding neighbors. 62 sevens, the second subdivision of the 77s is 62 sevens of years. What's that? Mathematician will tell you 434 years. It's 7 times 62. So we're not told that any kind of gap exists between the first and the second subdivision. So you bang them together. So the second period of 62 sevens continues immediately after the first subdivision of the 7 sevens. No break in between, which gives us a total of 69 sevens or 483 years. The ending of the first 69 sevens is unto Messiah the Prince. Now, he taught that Messiah would be on earth 483 years. This is Gabriel, 483 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem had been issued. The obvious conclusion is this: if Messiah was not on earth 483 years after a decree was issued to rebuild Jerusalem, then Daniel is a false prophet, and his book shouldn't be in the canon of Scripture. But if Daniel was correct and his prophecy was fulfilled, then who was the Messiah of whom he spoke? Who was it? Now, we have some events now between the 69th seven and the 70th seven. And this we find in verse 26. And after the 62 weeks shall the anointed one be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and even unto the end shall be war. Desolations are determined. So he begins in verse 26 after. That is after what? After the 62 sevens, which must themselves allow or must follow immediately after the first set of 7 sevens. So after the conclusion of the second subdivision, there's going to be a gap of time before we come to the 70th seven. In this verse, we're given some of the events that will occur between the close of the 69th seven and the commencement of the 70th seven. This is the gap of time where we are in today. This is where we are. And while there was no gap of time between the first 7 sevens and the second subdivision, the 62 sevens, there is a break between the second and third subdivision. Verse 26 makes this very clear. It is only after the 69th seven and before the 70th seven, which begins in verse 27, that 3 specific things will happen. What are they? First, Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Hebrew word translated cut off, it's a very common word used in the Mosaic law and simply means to be killed. Now, the implication of the term is that the Messiah would not only be killed, but also that he would die a penal death by execution. Hebrew expression translated and have nothing has 2 possible meanings. It may mean nothingness, emphasizing Messiah's state at death. He had nothing. It can also be translated, but not for himself. And the meaning would then be that he died for others rather than for himself. He died a substitutionary death. This is far more consistent with what the prophets had to say about the reason for Messiah's death. And Isaiah 53, 1-12 speaks about this. Now, the first 3 purposes of the 77s, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, have all to be accomplished by some means of atonement. Has to be an atonement. Why? Because the law of Moses decreed that atonement is made by blood. And if you want to check that, have a look at Leviticus 17:11. So it appears that Messiah's death, not for himself, but for others, would be how Israel's transgression, Israel's sin, and Israel's iniquity would be atoned for. The point of this phrase is that between the end of the second subdivision, which is the 69th seven, and before the start of the 70th seven, Messiah would be killed and would die a penal substitutionary death. Second thing, during this interim period, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. So the city and the temple, which were to be rebuilt because of the decree by which the 77s began, would now be destroyed. Sometime after the Messiah was cut off, Jerusalem and the temple would suffer another destruction. Now, our knowledge of history is pretty clear. The people responsible for this destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, those the Romans. Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in the year AD 70. And based upon this verse, it is clear then that the Messiah should have both come and died prior to 70 AD 70. If such an event did not take place, then Daniel was a false prophet. But if such an event did occur, then the question must be answered. Who was that Messiah who was killed before AD 70? Who was he? The third event that happens in the gap is even to the end, there will be war. So following Messiah's death in AD 30 and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, for the remainder of the interval, there was going to be a lengthy period of warfare in the land. It means the land of Israel will be characterized by war. Now, historically, since AD 70, there have been many wars and conflicts within the area known as the land of Israel. And this will eventually set the stage for the third subdivision. It is warfare that will bring the final seven about. And have a look at Israel today, and you'll realize that it's continuing on. Verse 26 ends with the expression, desolations are determined. Now, the word for desolations refers to the state of the land during the periods of war and their results. The fact that this has been determined means that it has been decreed by God as part of these 77s. So a lengthy period has been determined or decreed by God for the remainder of the gap. Again, verse 26 clearly points out that between the second subdivision and the third subdivision, that's between the end of the 69 weeks and the beginning of the 70th week, you have a gap of time in which these three things will occur. The 70th seven, Daniel 9:27. He shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 7. And in the midst of the 7, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And upon the wing of abomination shall come one that maketh desolate, and even unto the full end. And that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. Okay. We have this break of time. When the prophetic time clock in relation to Israel was stopped at the end of the 69th seven. So when will the 70th seven begin? What is the event which will start the clock ticking away again? What is the event by which we can know that the 70th seven has begun? We have one event that started the whole process off, and that was the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. So what will be the starting point of this final seven? The answer is given in verse 27. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week or 7. That is the starting point of the 70th seven. Now, the pronoun he, who's the he? The pronoun he refers back to its nearest antecedent, which we find in verse 26. The nearest antecedent is the prince that shall come. In other words, the prince that shall come of verse 26 and the he who makes the covenant in verse 27 are one and the same individual. Both of them refer to the one we now know as the Antichrist, who back in Daniel 7 is the final world ruler of the times of the Gentiles. And he will make a firm covenant. The phrase to make firm means he will impose. He'll impose a very strong covenant. He'll have the authority to do this because of his universal power. Now, remember, wars were characteristic of Israel, so he's going to offer them a covenant of peace. So the event which starts these last 7 years ticking away is the forcing or the confirming or the imposition of a firm or strong covenant between the Antichrist and Israel. Now, second, and in the midst of the seven, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So, in the middle of the 70th seven, that is after 3.5 years of signing this covenant, this Gentile leader will break his treaty with Israel. And that was intended to last 7 years, but he breaks it. And by breaking it, he also causes a cessation of the sacrificial system. He causes the sacrificial system to end. So the implication here is that by this time, there will be a temple in Jerusalem. The sacrificial system of Moses will have been reinstituted, and then it'll be stopped by force by this person who signed the covenant. Third thing is, in the place of the sacrificial system, which the Jews will have inaugurated upon the basis of the Mosaic law, the Antichrist will demand the setting up of his own image. Upon the wing of abominations shall come one who maketh desolate. Word abomination, well, where we see the word abomination, it has to do with an image or an idol. And as we know from other passages, the image of the Antichrist will be set up in the temple compound. Just as back in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, so it'll be again in the future, when a Gentile ruler will abominate the temple by means of idolatry. Fourth thing, the abomination is to be followed by wrath and desolation, persecution, warfare. For the remaining half of the 70th seven, or for the final 3.5 years, and this is like the trials and tribulations the rabbi spoke of as preparation for the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. These terrible days were referred to as the footsteps of the Messiah, and also as the birth pangs of the Messiah. This is what the rabbis term it as. So once these days have run their course, the last three things predicted in verse 24 will occur. The age of righteousness will be brought in, the most holy place will be anointed, and every vision and prophecy will be fulfilled. And at this point, the Messianic kingdom for which the prophet Daniel yearned for, right, all those thousands of years before, will now be set up. Yeah, obviously, the Messianic kingdom requires the Messiah to rule as king. This means the Messiah will come after the 70th seven. But earlier on in the book of Daniel, he stated that the Messiah would come and he would be killed after the 69th seven. So this would appear to be a bit of a contradiction unless Daniel was speaking of two comings of the Messiah. The first time was to be after the 69th seven, when he would die a penal substitutionary death for the sins of Israel, and he would accomplish the first three purposes listed in verse 24, which was to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity. Now, the second time he comes is still future, and that was to be after the 70th seven, when he'll establish the Messianic kingdom and accomplish the last three things of verse 24, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So there's a very important implication here that we should not miss. What is it? The Messiah would be killed after his first coming, yet he'd be alive at his second coming. And the implication is, and this is back in Daniel's day, the implication is that the Messiah would be resurrected from the dead after he was killed. Now, what can we conclude from this? Well, Messiah was to be on earth 483 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Second, after his appearance on earth, he was to be killed, not for his own sins, but rather for those of others. And the death he would die was to be the death of the penalty of the law. Third, the death of the Messiah had to come sometime before Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and this happened in AD 70. So he had to come and die before AD 70. Fourth, sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and following a long period of warfare, the 70th seven will commence. Once that has run its course, Messiah's kingdom and age of righteousness will be established. And for that to occur, the implication is that Messiah who was killed would return. But who is this Messiah? Only one person, only one man fulfills all that is required in this passage, and that is Jesus of Nazareth. He is born into the Jewish world and proclaimed his messiahship 483 years after the decree to rebuild and restore Jerusalem was issued. In the year AD 30, Jesus was executed by crucifixion. Daniel indicated that he would be cut off, not for himself, but rather for others. Isaiah 53 also prophesied the death of the Messiah, pointing out that he would die a substitutionary death on behalf of his people Israel. Now, the teaching of the New Testament is that Jesus died a penal death by taking upon himself the penalty of the law as a substitute for his people. In keeping with Daniel 9, verse 24, he died for the purpose of making an atonement for sins. 3 days after his death, he was resurrected. Finally, the New Testament proclaims the fact that he will someday return to set up his kingdom and the age of righteousness. If Daniel was right, then Messiah came and died prior to the year AD 70. If Daniel was right, then there are no other options for who the Messiah is. It has to be Jesus of Nazareth. If Daniel was right, this Jesus is destined to return and to set up the Messianic kingdom. So, what have we learned? After all of that, what have we learned? Well, from Daniel 9, 24 to 27, it teaches us that Messiah would be present 483 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Messiah would be legally executed. Messiah's death would result in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Messiah's birth and death, therefore, must both have happened prior to AD 70. And the only one who fills all of that is Jesus of Nazareth, our Messiah, our Savior. That is where we end this study on Messiah's first coming prophecies. Pray God it will help you in your growth, and study hard, grow strong. And we'll see you next time with Israel, past, present, and future. Thank you for coming along.